Now, Samaya will be joined to unpack this by Jeffrey White, CEO at Agility Logistics Park, Richard Howe, CEO at Africa Logistics Properties, Adrian Fay, Board of Directors Chairman at Morse Parks, Industrial Park and Free Trade, Lee Perrin, Data Center, MEA Director at CBRE Accelerate, and Gregory George Burke, Head of Site Selection at Africa Data Centers. Please help me welcome this panel.
Estamos salvos e estamos vivos. Agora não temos mais nada a perder. Nós nos tornamos imortais.
Oh, this is weird. No problem. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's panel discussion. We've got 60 minutes. We've got a lot to talk about, so I'm going to dive right in and set the scene. So as we promisingly find ourselves at the tail end of the pandemic, we've had to stay on our tippy toes and navigate some of the geopolitical tensions that we find in Russia and the Ukraine. And so what we'll do today is try to take stock of some of the emerging and perhaps new frontier asset classes that we're seeing in the market. We're also going to then create the linkage to global operators turning their attention into Africa and what that means for us from a continental perspective. As a reminder, my name is Sumaya Joshua. I'm from Absa Bank's Commercial Property Finance Division. I'm joined by a familiar team of panelists today. We've got Jeffrey from Agility Logistics Park. We've got Adrian from Morse Parks. We've got Lee Perrin from CBRE Data Centers. We've got Richard from Africa Logistics Parks. And we've got Gregory Burke from Africa Data Centers. Just to put a bit of structure into the conversation today, I think we're going to start with special economic zones. And we'll then create the linkages into asset classes like industrial, like discover or talk about some of the trends that we're seeing on the continent around e-commerce, trends in technology, and how that then starts to, well, lands us up at a conversation around data centers. I'll try and permit some time to take some questions from the audience. And so somebody just needs to keep me honest because I'm infamously known for running out of time. And then what we'll do after we've taken some questions, I'll circle back to the panelists and just get from you what your freshest or top of mind thoughts are as we conclude the session, right? So I think let's get right into it. So if you think about special economic zones, we've certainly seen them playing a critical role in how it is that certain economies have promulgated or promoted economic growth. China is an example of success where we've seen the way that they have thought about special economic zones has actually contributed 22% to their GDP and has had a significant impact on their employment levels. I think I read somewhere that it's created 30 million direct jobs just as a result of how it is that these economic zones have been set up. So, Adrian, I'm going to start with you and ask you, in supporting the continent's economic growth, how do we think about special economic zones on a more sustainable basis? And what are the factors to consider to really make this a success?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Adrian, as you said, from Mozambique, a little bit from Switzerland, but more and more from Mozambique. And there I'm the chairman of the Mozambican National Developer of Special Economic Zones. Now, what makes zones successful? You mentioned China. What is successful in Africa? What would you say? Giving back the question, who are the success stories within us in Africa?
I mean, I can think of let's talk about Mozambique as an example, and you've got a lot more color to that. I'd like to understand, how it is that you've, what's been your experience in setting these zones up, and what is it that has been the spin-off, not just from the obvious economic activity that it is that we're trying to promote, but what's been the social spin-off for Mozambique specifically. And I'd also like to hear from you. I mean, I understand that you've been involved outside of Mozambique to just create the platform and perhaps the thought leadership around what good should look like when we're setting up these zones. Talk to us about what that journey looks like, and particularly tell us about your direct Mozambique story and what the audience can take out of it.
Yeah, thank you. So you didn't give names. So let me start with names, because I have to disappoint you. The Mozambique story is not a story of success. It has become a story of success, but historically, it's a story of failure. Why? We started 20 years ago. We had this wonderful first huge investment in Mozambique called Mozal. That's an aluminium smelter from BHP Billiton. And Mozal said, we want a special economic zone around us. And their interest was to have a protecting zone around Mozal, which I think is very clever. But then $250,000 were spent on studies. I think PD Naudo did the studies, so they must have been very lucky. And they found out we can make Mozambique extremely successful if we bring downstream aluminium and we process it and we expand that. And that's the whole thing. And you know, Somaya, how many companies that entered after this $250,000 study?
Tell us.
Nothing, not even one. You know why? Because we had no water and no electricity. And the understanding was that the government will do that, and the government thought the private sector will do that. So it didn't work. So lesson number one you need, and I'm sure Jeffrey agrees with that, you need power and water and roads. You can't do a zone when you don't have that. So who are the success stories in Africa? Morocco is incredibly successful. Tanger Med, that's our superstar in Africa. They have 70,000 people. They have a car industry. They're expanding into medical, into high tech. They do everything right. So what is their key to success? They have a willing government. Government said, listen, let's do it together with private sector. They invited developers to build a port and a special economic zone and gave them all the freedom and gave incentives. That made them the most successful guys in Africa. Who is successful is Rwanda. Rwanda is successful again, a willing government, very creative government that accepts the small market size that Rwanda has and comes with tiny little projects, but does it extremely well and attracts the likes of Volkswagen now to assemble cars, the likes of Google to have technology solutions. So the relationship with government is essential for success. Because our game is not an easy game. 50% of our parks in Africa are public-private. So you need government to be involved because we manage huge real estate. And yeah, we didn't discuss what is a special economic zone. You see, that's very easy. It's a generic terms. It includes everything. It's an export zone, a free zone, industrial park, a technology park. Everything is a special economic zone by definition. So it's a generic term.
Thank you. So I'm actually glad that you mentioned Morocco because, interestingly, it was so when the Moroccan team members that set up these SEZs got it right, what I found out is that just industrial has managed to contribute at least 25% to GDP in 2018, and that trend has been an improving trend, which is fantastic. And it leads me to my next question for you, Adrian. So is there an elevated focus on industrial specifically as we start to see momentum in how it is that we set up these zones? And how does that contrast to what we're seeing outside of South Africa? So what are the global trends more generally around, what are the property asset classes that have had direct benefit as a result of these economic zones that's quite topical at the moment?
So what we managed to do in Mozambique, we managed to turn around the business completely. So now we are very successful and we are expanding. So now we just signed an agreement with government to build 20 parks in the next 10 years. So why does the model work now? And the difference is in the definition of the word industrial. You see, if you say in Mozambique we're industrial, we want to bring garments and textile and car manufacturing and computers, we won't make it. We're a small market. We're a $12 billion GDP market, so we won't make it. But if we say, where are the low-hanging fruits? We discover a lot of very beautiful things in Mozambique. We are beautiful in Mozambique because we have the nicest prawns and the nicest cashew nuts and the beautiful beaches. But in terms of industrial activity, what makes us beautiful, we have 50 projects over $500 million. And these are mainly mining projects. And mining projects are beautiful because they're all over Mozambique in rural areas. So our business model is to support the miners with industrial parks to do the supply industry there and build up value chains like agro processing, like construction material. So Mozambique has turned to become the most successful park development in Africa in terms of impact. We are the #1 impact nation in Mozambique when you take investment and impact. And that's I would say, our definition of industrialization. Go for the low-hanging fruits, take what is there, and not try to invent the wheel again with $250,000 studies.
Fantastic. So I want to talk about the advantage that you mentioned and figure out, is there an absolute advantage by bringing in some of the consumers? So Gregory, tell me, do you really see value in how these zones have been set up? And how do you think about site selection when you think specifically data centers? Talk to us a little bit about that and try and tell us about some of the pains that you've experienced. Before you start, I did not mention that I really would like to encourage that we have a conversation about it. So please feel free to check and challenge each other's views. My role will be to try and keep the peace as far as I can. But it would be great if we can have it quite interactively. And if you want to direct a question to your colleagues and panelists, please do so. And I'll try and not get myself into trouble and manage the time appropriately. So let's get back to you. Are you seeing the advantage? What is it? And what are the things that you've struggled with? And then perhaps what's the lessons that you've taken out of that struggle?
Sure. So if I look at, say, well-developed SEZs outside of Africa, the two that I've been involved with was Masdar City in Abu Dhabi and then Dubai Production City. And they've been very successful in data centers within those regions, within those Sorry. The reason for that is because they already have existing services. They can supply power, connectivity, etc. It basically encompasses all of our requirements, within one specific area. But then the lead to that is the fact that we can actually bring in the equipment tax-free, which is a major issue in Africa in particular with the high taxes. We then can pass those savings on to our end customers, so it becomes very lucrative. We've had great success with a free zone in Lagos called Eco Atlantic, and that's our first entry into an SEZ. So basically, when it comes down to our site selection, it really is one of the chart toppers that we look at, try and target SEZs to basically facilitate, in the end, onward savings that we can give on to our end users and customers.
Thank you. So let's go to Jeffrey. I mean, you've done quite a bit, particularly if I go back to Mozambique, because that's our point of reference today. I don't want us to just focus on the Moz story, but we have some interesting data points. So, Jeffrey, tell me in how it is that you've established your operations in Mozambique and in the likes of Ghana. Tell me, what is the benefit actually? I mean, we're talking about a little bit of the tax benefits that are coming through, but what are the real benefits, and how is that materializing into your feasibilities?
So I think, interestingly, there isn't a single answer. So SEZs are like investing in Africa. Investing in Nigeria is totally different to investing in Mozambique, which is totally different to investing in Cairo, which is totally different to investing in Kenya. And the SEZ legislation, the motivation behind it changes drastically from country to country. So there isn't one consistent, this is what an SEZ provides across the continent. It's different everywhere you go. From our perspective as Agility, when we're doing site selection, I think we have a matrix that we work through to see where we want to build our warehouse parks. And top of that is location, location, and location. Tenure is probably second on that, so preferably freehold, if not very long leasehold. So that immediately defines where you might go. We then move to having discussions about the investment attraction for the continent. And if you go to most countries in Africa now have investment promotion agencies, so often the availability for foreign direct investors like us through the investment promotion agency is actually aligned with or similar to what you get from going to an SEZ. So an SEZ isn't a given for us. We think that where we're going, the investment criteria that are available just as a foreign direct investor of substance are actually the main drivers, but the location of where we want to be is essential. If I give you an example in Nigeria, I mean, we looked across the whole of Lagos for our first Nigerian project. We spoke to customers, we spoke to existing Nigerian businesses, where they would relocate if they had the option, where the SEZ is, etc. And we ended up on Ibadan Road, which demographically has 50 million residents within 4 hours drive. So, I mean, it's a center of a massive market. It's got great access. It's potentially got fantastic fiber. It's got water. It's on the gas pipeline. So there's a whole matrix that goes into deciding where you're going to build your project within a country, and where sometimes that aligns with an SEZ, sometimes it doesn't. I think an interesting point on that as well is a lot of SEZ legislation across the continent is all focused on production for export. So it's not for domestic markets. Our warehouse parks are very much focused on aligning with SMEs, the growth of SMEs, the domestic market, the continental free trade zone as it develops. But we've had a lot of pushback from customers who are saying, we don't want to be in an SEZ because it brings a whole lot of bureaucracy about how we run our business, what reporting we do. So if you look at a project that we're currently designing in East Africa, which is a 100-acre site, we're going to have 50% of that, so 50 acres will be an SEZ, and 50 acres actually won't be, and they'll be adjacent to each other, and customers will be able to move from one to the other as they want. But I think just to automatically say, oh, SEZs are the solution to everything, they're a partial solution, they bring advantages, but they're not necessarily the solution, and certainly not in every case.
And do you think that we should work harder at making them the right solution on an overall basis and creating synergies across the continent? Or is it something that perhaps we're focusing on for the wrong reasons?
So I think as a headline initiative to attract foreign direct investment, it starts the conversation, it gets people interested. Again, going back to location, too many times SEZs are used to try and go to somewhere where there's no development or no business to try and stimulate economic growth in that region. The reality is that's contrary to somebody who's building warehouse parks that actually wants to be full of tenants who are servicing the market they're actually in.
Fantastic. So I'm going to, kind of tilt the conversation a bit and talk a little bit about industrial, because that's where you're already going, and thanks for helping me. I mean, we've definitely seen industrial assets maintain its value in spite of the pandemic, driven by a couple of reasons, or a couple of factors at least, including the accelerated adoption of online shopping, an increase in regional trade activity across the continent, hopefully supported by the AFCA. And I know, Jeffrey, you've got some interesting views on that, and I'm going to rope you in to give that to me towards the end of the conversation. A growing middle class, and really the need to future-proof our supply chain. So tell me a little bit about your business case, the geographies that you've been to so far. What's been your biggest winner, and what's potentially been your biggest loser? And then finally, how do you deal with the asset that's perhaps not the darling?
Okay, so I think it's difficult if you're tenacious and you're not fussed about time frames. It's difficult to lose in Africa. The macro story of what's going on is so strong about the demographics, the urbanization, the growth of the middle class. I thought the earlier presentation on the lower income going up the value chain was really interesting. And we're seeing a phenomenal amount of interest in companies wanting to come to Africa. And I think a couple of drivers of that. One is post-pandemic, there's an awful lot of manufacturing companies that got into huge difficulties around their logistics and supply chain. And actually, that's not improved a lot since the pandemic. It's just as dire as it was. So there is definitely a momentum to say we want to produce locally and more locally to our consumer, to our market. So we're seeing an increase in interest from global manufacturers saying, okay, rather than building huge volumes in China and shipping it all around the world, perhaps we should have a production plant in Nigeria or in Ghana or where we are, and actually batch produce with the internet technology nowadays at more or less the same cost price, but actually be close to market. And I think that's one of the big drivers of Morocco, is people relocating to Morocco because it's on the side of Europe. So you wouldn't want to build in Asia with all the logistics problems of getting through the Suez Canal and getting containers, etc., to move goods to Europe. So there's a required impetus to say, let's manufacture next to our market. So I think that's a positive that's come out of the pandemic. I think we're seeing a significant growth in SMEs and African companies. So if I look at our customer split, is about 50-50. So, I mean, we've got an open park that's operating in Côte d'Ivoire, in Ghana, in Mozambique. We're under construction in Nigeria. And we've got another 4 that we're sort of about to add, including Cairo, hopefully Morocco, Kenya, etc., to give us a sort of Pan-African platform. But what we're seeing is that at least 50% of the demand is from local SME companies. And they're getting a lot of impetus on the same momentum, where global companies are saying, let's find an agent in Nigeria that actually represents us and distributes our product for us. So we're seeing a lot of traction along that. On the other side of the coin, I think Ukraine and Russia, and particularly what Putin has said this morning, is unhelpful for global confidence and for what's going on. And I mean, we've had a couple of customers just recently who had gone through the whole process of due diligence, send down the security teams, send down the compliance teams, send down the health and safety teams, tick all the boxes. Yes, we want to move into one of your warehouses, that have said, actually, we're putting things on hold given the state of the global economy currently. So we really see our main drivers moving forward are SME growth and development. And then again, those companies that are wanting to relocate their manufacturing and production into Africa. And if I look at just the last point on that, if I look at our customer split, I mean, everybody assumes that sort of we do logistics. The reality is, if you look at our standard warehouse park, 35% is 3PL and logistics companies. 65% is companies that are doing added value, so bringing in bulk and repackaging for retail, agri-processing, assembly, etc. So it's actually very much aligned with the growth of industry, and then there's an add-on side of that, which is distribution and logistics.
Okay, fantastic. So I want to, before I go to Richard, I was quite pleased at the balance on the panel, because we have Jeffrey, who is obviously agility, and I always have to make sure that I don't mix the two entities up. But what's interesting is that his business case is predominantly focused on West Africa and Southern Africa. And then you've got Richard, who is from Africa Logistics Parks, my apologies. And your focus is typically East African. I want to understand, if we listen to Jeffrey and what he talks about insofar as cost versus benefit, are you seeing, similarities in East Africa? Do you think the benefits are comparable? Or, tell us about, how to think about Africa perhaps not as one place, but as, a host of countries that are unique on their own, that have got their own dynamics from a macroeconomic perspective, from a population growth perspective, and just from a what's driving that underlying growth, particularly in industrial. Give me a sense of the trends that you're seeing and where you think the biggest gains have been so far.
Yeah, I mean, Jeffrey has a much wider portfolio than we do. We are very focused just on East Africa. So I couldn't really talk with any authority about the markets that Jeffrey has more experience of in the West. In East Africa, I do recognize some of the trends that Jeffrey talks about, but some things have been very different for us. We've been at this 5 years now, and I have to say our balance in terms of where our demand has come from has been different. Our demand has been much more homegrown. So there's the classic SME businesses that we talk about, but there's also very strong Kenyan startups, which then receive a lot of international funding, but they are Kenyan companies. When we first put together the business case for ALP, we believed we would see a lot stronger demand from multinationals that either were already in East Africa or wanted to come to East Africa and didn't come because there wasn't a building. And to be really honest, that demand hasn't really turned up. So 80–90% of our portfolio is filled with companies that are instigated in region. They may be financed externally, some of them by some of our sponsors. But that's been very much the story of our demand. And we've had a number of what I call waves of hope in terms of the multinationals turning up. One of those was just before COVID. And we're beginning to get another one of those now. We are definitely beginning to see manufacturers very much talking to what Jeff is, looking at their supply chain, saying it really isn't good enough just to produce all this stuff in China and then hope that we can ship it around the world. So they're breaking up their manufacturing hubs, and they're beginning to look at East Africa as one of the places that really ticks all of the boxes for them. So that is beginning to happen. It hasn't happened yet, but we are hopeful that this time we will see a real input from the multinational side of things. In terms of the fundamentals of this asset, the reasons we like this asset is because it works in so many places. We're not reinventing the wheel. We know these assets work not just in first world markets, but in lots of second world markets and third world markets. So we're confident that these buildings add a lot of value over the fullness of time. They may not add it quite as quickly as we like sometimes, but they will get there. There's nothing new or really fundamentally radical about the buildings that we build. We know they can add value. We just need to make sure we get all of the conditions around those buildings right for the local market.
So let's talk a little bit about Tatu City. So I visited recently, and I was fascinated to see the level of infrastructure investment that's gone in there. Talk to me about how important, and I know on our prior panel there was some conversation about the infrastructure and real estate is absolutely almost married. But tell me about, let's talk about how critical that actually is in real terms, and let's talk about, in your view, what we still need to do to get our infrastructure right or more improved so that we can actually get the real value out of the logistics story that we know is unfolding in East Africa? What do we need to do? What's urgent? And how do we, if we need to, how do we create that burning platform for us to see the progress?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting on the earlier comments about the SEZ is not a silver bullet.
Yeah.
Just declaring an SEZ and hoping that people turn up doesn't work. You know, I've stood in parts of Tanzania that have been designated an SEZ, and they make an excellent wildlife reserve, but they're not actually going, no one is actually going to come there because there isn't any infrastructure. So the SEZ, in my mind, is an accelerator to a business case which is already working or is on the cusp. And part of that business case has to be that either the state, or in the case of Tatu City, a private enterprise has undertaken to produce that infrastructure for you at scale. So it's the same old stuff: roads, water, electricity, and fiber. So you must believe that those things are going to be there, and they're either being provided by the state or in the Rendeavour model, the sort of new orbital city master planning case. So those things, so one of those two must be doing it. And I think in most cases in East Africa, inevitably you look to the state, perhaps sometimes enabled by development funds, to produce that basic infrastructure. Because if you don't get that, you can build the best A-class logistics building in the world, but if it just immediately tips out onto a road which is, you know, clogged with traffic, filled with potholes, has no certainty of any delivery times, you're wasting your money. It just doesn't work. You know, an A-class logistics building is only part of a supply chain. You have to have the rest of it there. So even if you're just looking at basic dry storage, never mind the more complicated cold storage things, you've got to have basic infrastructure around these things to make it work. And in most cases, you've got to look to the state to do that to a minimum level, otherwise it just doesn't work. But in fairness, in East Africa, you know, for those of you who know Kenya, Kenya's road building program after the last 5 years, the country is barely recognizable to where it was when I first turned up. The orbital roads around Nairobi and the roads going further west into the country, much better than they were 5 years ago. So that is happening. So there is great hope that supporting infrastructure is in place. And you can begin to see that happen in other East African countries as well. So I think it is coming. So I think the story is intact.
And is it coming as a result of government prioritizing it, or is there a level of public-private partnerships?
I think largely our experience in East Africa, it's because the governments understand that that basic infrastructure really does drive economic development and gets them the jobs they need. We've talked a lot about the demographic dividend for Africa. It's only a dividend if you can provide these people with jobs. So you need to have basic infrastructure, and then allowing private enterprise to use that infrastructure is what fills those gaps.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back to you, Jeffrey. So when we had our catch-up, you shared with me that Africa has a long history of promising strong growth and of under-delivering. What is Agility's business case for continuing to want to do business in Africa in spite of that view?
I think the opportunity is clear. I mean, like I said before, the macro trends, the fact that you're going to have a third of the world's population living in Africa by 2050, the continental free trade zone we think is going to be an economic driver of real significance across the continent as it rolls out, and they have to manage expectations properly. It's a 10-year process. But I think all of those aspects individually make you very comfortable that you can invest in a portfolio of warehouse parks across Africa that have, in the medium and long term, real return potential. The challenge in Africa is it takes longer to develop than it does elsewhere in the world. I'm forever sort of not fighting, but having friction with the board who can build a warehouse in Saudi Arabia in half the time it takes us to build it in Africa. And likewise, the per square meter cost of building in Africa is more than it is in other countries. Just the cost of logistics, the cost of sorting the goods to build your project is just that much more expensive on the continent. But that, I think, is from a strategic perspective, if you have a vision in 10, 20 years' time to have a network of large warehouse parks around all the major economic centers on the continent, that it's very difficult for anybody to deny that that makes sense. And there's going to be hiccups and steps and challenges along the way. In Nigeria, we had title problems. But I think one of our synergies with data centers is Agility's philosophy on every site we take is to get absolute 100% security on the title deeds. And land tenure in Africa, as the whole audience knows, is really a very big issue. But I mean, we've got 500,000 square meters in Abidjan, where it's freehold. We've got the site in Ghana, the site in Cote d'Ivoire, in Tema in Ghana, in Lagos now sorted. We had some hiccups along the way, but it's now sorted in Mozambique. And if you're putting down a platform, and what we do typically is we buy a large site that we can scale into. So Abidjan's an example. We bought 500,000 square meters site on PK26. It's freehold. The first phase on that, you could potentially build 250,000-ish square meters of warehousing on it. The first phase on that, which is just sort of coming to completion now, is sort of 35,000. That's totally sold out. We're adding more, and you've got to match supply and demand. But again, I think if you're investing in Africa, you're not investing for the next couple of years. You're investing on a long-term macro opportunity, and if you can, you need to get your capital base, and for us, which is our land bank, aligned with that opportunity for the next 20 years.
So in front-running this, the vision, right? I just want to get both your perspective and yours, Richard. So we've spoken about the fact that it's a long-term play. You're putting patient capital into these asset classes. It's a mixed bag of, local SMEs, some multinationals, smaller local clients. It potentially is a cash flow, some hard currency, some local currency. And given that it is so emerging, and given that you are taking this long-term view, and you are setting the market up, right? At what point do you think that other investors might cotton on to the business case? At what point do you start seeing a secondary market develop? Where we have willing buyers wanting to buy established assets, newer assets, more modernized assets. When do we start to see that happening so we can start to really test the value that's been created, test the yield assumptions that we've put into our structures? How long before we start getting there?
Shall I go on that, Richard, first? Yeah. The reality is it's a long, slow process to educate people as to the benefits of being in a first world product. And I think both ALP and ourselves went through a learning curve that you don't want to build an overly sophisticated project. So what the market's not looking for is a Mercedes. They're actually looking for a Land Cruiser. Yeah, and the Land Cruiser is better than the broken down vehicle that they're using just now. It gives them security, it gives them 24-hour power, connectivity, fast broadband, cleanliness and compliance. So but you don't want to overspec it because then you're not competitive in the market. So I think certainly the first generation of projects for the next sort of 10 years in the rest of Africa are nowhere near as sophisticated as the quality warehousing here in South Africa. We were out visiting a whole bunch of new developments, the DSV site and other things, which are really world-class sophisticated warehousing parks. Yeah? The reality in Africa, it's much more about creating an environment where everything works, it's secure, it's safe, it's efficient. But it's a slow process to get customers to actually buy into that. Now, what we're doing is building a very strong track record of customers who have come in, taken 3,000, and then said, actually, this is great, we need more, it works. So you get really strong customer feedback in the market. We're also seeing, I think, a trend where a lot of the more sophisticated African businesses historically built their own warehousing and office infrastructure and everything purely because it didn't exist in the market. So I think one of the big trends we're seeing is that established companies who are in sort of either needing more space or are considering building the new facilities themselves, and historically where owner-occupiers are actually saying, actually we don't need to now because there's finally something in the market that we can use for our business.
Richard, your views?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that. I mean, I think it's very easy to overspec. I think the approach we've taken to it is you want the building to have a long life, whether you're holding it or whether you're making a case to sell it eventually. So what we've done is we've tried to design the building so that you can add specification to it later. So you can add more docks, you can add upgrades to fire systems as those things are demanded. But if you put those things in on day one, as Jeffrey says, you're just pricing yourself out of the market as it currently is. The biggest single driver of our business is successful tenants. So what you want is you want tenants to come in, particularly in the e-commerce space, and make those buildings work for you, because their businesses only work in your buildings. They don't work in the old classic go-downs, as we call them in East Africa. So when they come into that and when they make those businesses work, that demonstrates to the wider market that your businesses really, really add a lot of value. So sadly, you sort of have to go through that business cycle to actually establish that those assets have value. But to answer your question in terms of when you will see a secondary market, I don't think we're that far away from that. I think both of us have been at it a similar amount of time now. You've been through that cycle. You're beginning to see that, these assets really are holding their value. I mean, our assets have held their value much better in rental terms than the historic product, which has actually fallen in rental rates over the 5 years that we've been there. So you can demonstrate a track record now in terms of successful tenants, consistent cash flows, values holding up well. So once you get to that stage, you're not very far away from getting a secondary market going.
Great. So I think I'm going to move on. Let's talk a little bit about data centers. So, of course, data center additions are on the rise in Africa, driven by a couple of things, and particularly focused on what's been classified as key locations linked to economic growth. So, Lee, tell me a little bit about what's driving global operators turning their attention into Africa.
So I think it's pretty simple, right? If we look at the market in terms of mature markets, the US, EMEA, APAC, it's extremely large markets, bigger than we can ever imagine in South Africa. But in theory, just to give an example, like just UK is 1,000 megawatts of operating DC capacity now, with only like 50 million people. And I mean, the market is saturated. Like they got sites going live year on year. But it's purely market saturation. And I think there's been such an avoidance to go and trade in Africa for so long, it's left it as an untapped market. So we've all been reading data centers for quite a few months now. The final frontier, the second gold rush. So in theory, it's a final frontier for these large operators to deploy their facilities, and it's market share. And I mean, the discussion this morning was really good because it illustrated the sort of growth in demographics, because it's all about the people. So in terms of we the people that use the data center, right? So if you think about Nigeria, 200 million people, bunch of young kids, we got this baby making factory in the continent, so they're all operating on their phones all day long. So what they make in the day, they trade in the day. So the mobile traffic through mobile telephony, which we've now leapfrogged a lot of the mature markets, it's really got a massive drive. So if you're an operator and you want market penetration, the place to go is Africa.
Thank you. So, Gregory, you're certainly investing a lot of capital into this asset class. Tell us a little bit about your business case. Tell us about your location, and tell us about, why this is working. And I always like, as a banker, for you to share with me, what's been the school fees as well. So, what's the lessons learned for the audience benefit? And
Sure. As Africa Data Centers, we're currently live in Cape Town, Johannesburg, Nairobi, Lagos, and Lome. Our expansion plans accommodate Abidjan, Accra, Cairo, Casablanca, Kigali, Luanda. And basically, by facilitating that, we were talking about SEZ, so I'm just going to go back to a question before. So Basically, in our site search criteria, we fundamentally look, we are zoned as light industrial, but the problem is if we basically pick up a red flag, if there's an industry within that SEZ, let's say, that might potentially cause disruption to our facilities, to our equipment, etc., then we can't possibly be in that SEZ. So we have quite a stringent checklist that we have to go through and create red flag reports to basically establish that these locations are suitable for our deployment. As it sits currently, we've had no major lessons learned. We're still expanding and doing this organically. We're making all of our facilities as expandable, sizable as possible. So what we'll do is we'll build the entire shell and core to have that initial capital outlay, and then we'll then upscale as per our clients' requirements. But to basically get to why we've chosen these specific regions is the fact that we have to look at the per capita basis, the necessity for data centers within that region, and then also client requirements, becomes an attribute to that. So combining all those factors, we then decide and narrow it down to these specific locations, which I mentioned before. And it is very daunting and challenging. So it is a bit better to try and pair up with the companies that we have on stage here, to try and deploy within those specific locations. But sometimes it just doesn't work out within those industrial states, and we have to go it alone. And it does become more daunting. And there is a possibility of, obviously it is Africa, there is a possibility of failure. But as it sits currently, we haven't had anything major.
Those demand dynamics that you talk of, to what extent is that influenced by regulatory pressures to onshore data on the continent?
Sure. So when you say that, I think you're referring primarily to data sovereignty, which is basically trying to bring back data storage, in essence, to Africa, to specific regions or locations. So I think what's happening is that is habilitating the fact that we now need to deploy within these locations. We're getting government buy-in. And what will slowly happen is the cost will start diminishing, so become a more profitable business. Obviously, it hasn't been overcapitalized, as Lee has mentioned before, in Europe, where it is. But yeah, Africa is still one of the last, standing regions where, through government legislation, this habilitates the fact that we need to be in those specific locations. And it provides jobs, in essence, to the people, as opposed to outsourcing that to other continents. So it's a great sector to be involved with. Further to that, we also have a great necessity for a lot of energy, and so does the entire, continent. And given the fact of the disruption that we currently have with rising fuel costs, we can now pump more money into those sorts of things, which is green fuels, renewable energy. We would be the forerunner now, as opposed to before, where we're adopting technology that have been developed outside of the continent. We can now be one of the forerunners with these renewable technology advancements, which is what Africa needs fundamentally.
I want to come back to Lee. Gregory, when you talk about, the infrastructure that you need, how does that play out in your business model, in how it is that you manage the day-to-day business operations, reduce the risk, etc.?
Yeah, so I think I'm a little bit different to the rest of the panel, is that we don't physically have to go and own and operate this facility, and our assets are very alike. Like we've said, right? So in terms of the data center, it's a shell, could be powered or could be fully fitted. But I think where it becomes really unique for the data center market is the type of tenant that you have, which is a very critical tenant and potentially a very long-term tenant, which makes it a great asset class. But it's physically how you have to run these facilities. And that is the attraction to the global market, because I think everyone can agree that you've got the global market looking at us in terms of how are we physically going to run these facilities. We've got no power, we've got a massive skills gap. It's a very new market for us. So I think for physically running these assets are probably going to be our primary focus for the next few years, to ensure that we can at least give the global market some confidence that we physically can do this and attract larger players. But I think as part of the Africa Data Center Association, we've done a study last year to attract global interest, and we've done a survey in terms of operational quality across the continent. And we managed to get sort of input from all the major markets that we see as data center markets for Africa. And it was very interesting to see that the type of infrastructure or the environment that these guys have to operate in to keep these facilities alive. Like Nigeria, they're running on permanent fuel. So, their main supply is a generator. So the guys have to physically switch between generators to maintain them, to keep the site live, which is incredible. Right? I spent 14 years in the UK running data centers, and I think if the generator starts in the UK, everyone is frantic, like what's going on? you know. So, and in Kenya, you got green power, but it's very sort of very intermittent. So, and then you got guys having to switch power sources continuously. In South Africa, we all know we're sitting with 3 outages a day at the moment. The guys have to operate under extreme circumstances. So it actually puts our operational quality quite high. And obviously, you can see some cracks in the surface in terms of experience because we haven't had data centers for so long, so we haven't had to start looking at replacing these assets. So I think if we start looking at how we accommodate 5-year maintenance strategy plans, we've actually got quite a robust setup so that we can accommodate these assets.
Okay, fantastic. I'm definitely getting my last warning on a time check, so I'm going to change my mind and unfortunately not take questions from the audience. I will try and consolidate a couple of the points that I quickly scribbled down, and then I'd like to circle back to you guys for your final thoughts, and I'm going to give you 30 seconds so that I'm not in trouble with the API guys. So we spoke about, it's about power, water, roads. We've spoken about effective relationships with governments. We've spoken about the fact that SEZs is not, in fact, a silver bullet. Data centers is the final frontier. We are pretty much out of time. I'm going to let the guys just wrap up with their 30 seconds. And please feel free to reach out to the panelists outside of the conversation during the breaks to get some more of the insights. And please feel free to visit me at the APSA stand if you're interested in talking to us about bespoke funding solutions. So over to you.
Okay. So I think from our perspective, the macro opportunity, the requirement for international quality warehousing to support growth across the continent is undisputable. I mean, it's just so clear. The challenge, as always in Africa, is delivery, execution, getting the cost price right, and driving that process forward as timely as you can. But I think the nice bit about what I love about our business is we're creating jobs, prosperity, and supporting economic growth. Not just investment into Africa, but actually African businesses being able to grow and expand. And I think the Continental Free Trade Zone is going to enable African businesses to trade on a much larger regional scale. And I think in due course, that will lead to Africa actually becoming a global manufacturing hub that's able to compete globally.
Thank you. Adrian?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm believing strongly in this Mozambican model of economic zones. And we have more and more also visitors like the president of Zimbabwe and the president of Malawi. This week, the president of Tanzania visiting us and try to understand the model and take it over as well. And the model means really impact creation next to the business. And impact is job creation and entrepreneurship and environment. These are the 3 impacts we're targeting. For example, in one of our parks, our anchor investor there is a heavy sand miner, Kenmare. They have to reduce their carbon footprint, and they will produce 24 million liters of biofuel in that area. This is huge impact creators. So I believe in the impact model next to a standard business model, and I think that can really create the jobs and create the entrepreneurship opportunities in Africa. And the Mozambican outlook, just to make 10 seconds of marketing is good, huh? Not only the prawns and the cashew nuts and the beach. It's also the fact that we have this gas business that attracts $35 billion of investment. And the Italians are already in the market with Eni, Total and Exxon are lining up, and that will be a game changer with us. Thank you.
Great. Lee, 30 seconds, conclusionary, total elevator pitch.
So I think we'd love to get more involved with the SEZs in terms of how they structure this, because there's so much first world lessons that we can learn in terms of if we can start leveraging like cold storage to cool the data center, get the heat out the data center to go dry crops, whatever's needed. You create a little sort of bio infrastructure where we become very, very efficient. Very hard to do, but I think there's lessons that we can learn there. And I think digitizing the continent, I think you can see in the mature markets when you start planting data centers in, you can see it starting to light up. So I think it's a very good picture for Africa. So I'm the guy at the Bride. It's always very positive about the continent.
Yeah, very briefly, I think the macro case is absolutely as strong as it ever was, if not stronger. Don't underestimate it, the detail and the integration issues. The integration issues between SEZs, trade policies, government infrastructure projects, SEZ zones. It's hard work, it has to be done in detail, but when it works, it really does deliver. So it's worth it.
Deidre?
I'm just going to end on a more idealistic sentiment and say that, data centers, data brings us closer together. So, in essence, if we can facilitate expanding connectivity as well as data storage within Africa, that brings more jobs ultimately. So it would be my dream that within the next 5 to 10 years, that's the big push really, to try and facilitate, and through my learned colleagues here, I'd love to work with you guys to be able to facilitate that expansion. Yeah, I think our industries really pair up well. And there's great potential to expand this. Also encourage the younger youth to start learning to become data center experts, because I tell you what, we have a hell of a brain drain in South Africa in particular, but obviously in the rest of Africa, and it would be very, very strongly encouraged.
Great, thank you. It's great to hear that we're wanting to collaborate for Africa to continue to rise. Thank you for your time. I'm excited that we ended on a positive note, and I look forward to catching up with you over the break. Thanks, everyone.